Nesh Nikolic. How are you, Nesh?
Thank you. I'm well. Good time. Yourself?
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Thanks for your time. You are a clinical psychologist and you are specialized in acceptance and commitment therapy. We will talk about on your clinical psychology side. We would like to know issues in men and women which are specific in their lives. The first basic question is how you define psychological struggle, when it's a temporary thing or it's a well-rooted emotion becoming problematic, how to understand it.
It's a great question. I think struggles are inevitable in everyone's life. And the way that I like to think about struggles is really from a lens of looking at one's context. And so there's a common conception in psychology that we apply a diagnosis or a category to someone's struggle. And although that can be true, I believe that the context basically explains most of the difficulty. And so I'll often say if someone was able to be in the room with myself and a client of mine, or just sat in any clinician's room, if you heard the story and the challenges, the context, what led to someone's discomfort, pains, challenges, it would tell you the whole story and you'd probably very accepting and understanding of their struggles. And so for me, the context is everything rather than a category or a diagnosis, a label, if you will.
We know some struggles like typically jobs, relationship, health, etc., which is kind of up on your face. So you can see it, some physical manifestation. But there are definitely some internal struggle we all go through. So can you just give a little bit of a list of typical struggle which we not see in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even after retirement?
Look, I think the struggles in some way remain the same, but maybe the topic changes. And so, an example that I can give is most human beings are going to feel conflicted throughout their entire life. And a conflict that might occur when you're a child might be that you are invited to two parties or two events at the same time. One might be the sport that you're participating in. Another one might be that your friend has asked you to attend their birthday and they're a special friend of yours. And so you're conflicted. You feel the pressure of your mum and dad wanting you to attend to the sports. You might also want to attend the sport because you're passionate about it. Simultaneously, you want to be there for your friend, and you're actually afraid of how they might view you if you don't attend. So there's a conflict there in terms of the values that you hold at the same time. And as a parent, we try and support children in understanding that we have to kind of accept these conflicts and make space and room for them. The same thing is true when we move all the way through, adulthood and let's say a later stage when we're even retiring, where we could be conflicted yet again in terms of our identity, feeling that I need to maintain a role or a title to have value for myself. Am I no longer going to be a psychologist and therefore I've lost my status or my standing in society? But I'm still wanting other things in my life, like connection with family and the like. But there could be contribution factors there as well. So we see these conflicts all through life. Another example might be first-time mum who wants to be present and available for their child, and simultaneously not having some limited work capacity at that time for financial reasons or contextual reasons. So if we kind of look at it across the lifespan, there's an infinite number of struggles and challenges and pain points. And they can be also other contextual things like demanding managers, demanding relationships, people who are being rude, obnoxious, abusive even in many people's lives. There's also a concept around attachment or grasping. If I borrow from maybe some sort of Buddhist philosophy and many other philosophies as well, not just that one, is when we grasp for something that is important to us, when we hold it tightly, it can obviously be very painful when it doesn't work in the way that we would wish it to work. So we try and control it, we try and protect it, we try and hold on to it, but inevitably, it might be conflicted or it might be pulled away from us, it might be taken away. And so most things in life that bring us joy also end up in another context, bringing us some pain and discomfort.
So it's basically all an internal conflict, whether how much we like it, how much attached with it we are, versus how light, how dry we are, the relationship with that particular problem.
Yeah, and we sometimes might talk about in terms of a value that we would like to guide us and give us direction and purpose and meaning. But if we hold it so tightly, sometimes it turns into a rule. And so it says, this is how this thing must occur. And when it doesn't occur that way, it creates grief. So those who are accepting that their loved ones are going to disappoint them actually become less disappointed when something occurs in that way, while someone who's attached to their loved ones not disappointing and following the rules that they've put it to that context are probably going to be quite distressed when that disappointment occurs or comes up.
Some deep-rooted emotions, okay, like patriarchy. I came from India, so I understand it a little better. Childhood trauma, sexual abuse, war zone exposure, earthquake, like major events. So male, female, how they react differently and how much time required to heal this kind of thing.
Yeah, look, it's hard to speak on a population basis because each individual will respond differently. There are instances where we see that despite on the surface, we would not want to encourage, a war environment, physical, sexual assault for anybody, long-term neglect, abuse, and so on in anybody's context. There are some people who somehow find a way to not only work around it, but to instill a belief system inside themselves that can be quite pivotal in their life. So, for example, someone who's had challenging upbringing in childhood might become very strongly attached to ensuring that their children don't receive the same level of abuses. And so they make a series of decisions to be very protective as a parent. Similarly, some people can be propelled forward in their commitment to never having to experience that trauma again. The opposite is quite true as well, that some of those conditions can very much set up an environment where we could develop, learn, or be reinforced to feel an incredible amount of hopelessness and helplessness. Because when you're in a war zone, for example, when you're a child and you can't escape that environment, it can be very hopeless because you can't vote with your feet at that time. And if you have a certain type of temperament, if the conditions are such, there isn't many protections around you, other things to make you buoyant. You might be isolated from social networks and be struggling at school and be bullied in that environment as well. Then life can be really tough. And we know that when we're young, we tend to carry many of those learnings throughout life. They become core beliefs or heuristics that we continually look from, those perspectives that we bring forward. So the healing can be a lifetime. At the same time, in therapy, I've seen it be within a handful of sessions even. So it can be all the entire range. And that's not saying that one person is less capable than another, but it's a very difficult thing, those particular contexts that we're describing.
So, like a massive event in a small amount of time versus small dose of distress for a longer period of time, is there any suggestion that which one is easier to heal and which one is difficult to heal, or how we are internalize it? That's basically is an answer how we can heal ourselves.
I think there is some logic that we can see in terms of some correlations between a little bit of stress over a long period of time. Most people, that's kind of what their daily life looks like. But the higher we bring up that intensity of stress, obviously the more impact it has. We do know in psychology that when there is a very stressful situation, we can internalize that very quickly. So, post-traumatic stress response can occur from a single event. It could be a car accident, a home invasion, physical violence in the home on a one-off occasion, an accident in the workplace where you observe someone injure themselves in a serious way. It's almost like it fractures our belief system and says, I'm not secure. Everything is fragile. And so it can instantly make a profound change in us. And that's that post-traumatic stress response. I'd like to normalize that and say that kind of makes a lot of sense and is kind of expected in many instances without going out and invalidating or minimizing that experience. So I think we can do both things at the same time, where we could say it's normal and it's difficult to carry. I think there are those levers that are occurring in terms of the intensity and obviously the length of exposure. War is a classic example. I think war does fundamentally change cultures and communities in a profound way because it's inescapable. The intensity is unbelievably high. You don't get reprieve from it. There's lots of damage, not only in terms of death and destruction, but infrastructure, the way that a country operates and the like. So, war is an incredibly serious problem, but that war can also appear in a single home when there's domestic violence that's ongoing. So I think we can understand the context well. So there is obviously correlations that we would naturally find in those, but there is still individual differences across the board. Most soldiers who come back from war don't actually experience PTSD, D being the diagnostic part of a disorder, that they're still functional. They might have some effects from that war, but they can return to daily functioning relatively well.
These are the outside manifested events. What about the internal events? Let's say cheating or someone violated trust, where there is no as such physical violence, but there can be a very traumatic psychological violence going through. So the healing process or going about it is the same approach.
I don't want to dodge the question, but it is very much contextual. Yes, there's an insult to that internal psychological space. If I think about even post-traumatic stress response, more often than not, my clinical practice has shown me that there's a secondary insult that tends to trigger the response. So a lot of people can tend to manage when the first insult occurs. It might be injury, some sort of traumatic event where someone's harmed. Let's assume it's in the workplace, a driver in their workplace, and they hit a pedestrian or another car. And so most people can resolve that, and they say that was awful and difficult. But if there's a secondary insult, which is, let's say, their management don't support them, and their management say you've done something incredibly wrong, and they say we're going to stand you down, you're not allowed to speak to your colleagues, there's going to be an investigation in this, that can have a profound insult. So we might look at the picture and say it looks like they just hit someone in a vehicle and then an investigation was taking place. But in actual fact, the internal experience of losing trust of support, that they're going to be looked after, that they're going to be safe in the workplace, has also been damaged in the second instance as well. And hence why context is important in that post-traumatic stress response arena. I often see a secondary insult actually occur.
With age, is it getting easier or harder to deal with emotions? And is it kind of a societal factor also?
It's a great question. I don't know what the data says. I can certainly speak anecdotally and from my practice. If I think about my practice, we've got 20 plus clinicians. We rarely see older age clients. Let's call them 60 plus. We see some, but not that much. To me, that maybe suggests that when we get to a certain age, we've been able to develop some strategies, develop some coping mechanisms, but I think we might also develop a manner in which to accept challenges, a manner in which to philosophically adopt a perspective that challenges are unavoidable and we've got to make space for them. So we, in some sense, we surrender to that rather than we keep fighting. If I think about myself personally, there's lots of causes that I might be compelled to fight for as a young person that these days I just accept as being the reality of being human. And so I don't have to struggle, wrestle, have a conflict with those things, but rather it's just an easy position to say, that's just how the world is, that's life. I'm no longer in conflict. So I think as we age, we do tend to do that. And maybe we use the word more commonly of we just become more patient. We're a little bit more present, we're more patient, we're more understanding, we're more forgiving. I think that generally does occur with age and maturity, but I don't have any data to back that up.
Nicely put. What are the issues like men and women commonly carry that are often invisible to others? Are there any like that?
I think we can certainly say there are some gender differences, obviously, and I think that often comes with our roles in life. We do tend to have different roles, generally speaking, and that doesn't mean that men and women can't do most roles, but certainly, for example, women are childbearing, and therefore they tend to also be early child rearing, where they look after many of those needs, whether it's breastfeeding and then continuance on those other needs. So there are, in some sense, if I look at it, different things that we are exposed to. Yeah. We do know there are gender differences from the perspective of, let's say, for example, women are on a general population basis. The data tells us more interested in people, in connection, in those sort of humanities, while men have a little bit of a tendency towards things, objects, structures, engineering that they gravitate to as well. Obviously, as I mentioned, we can do both, but there is that tendency. There's also even personality differences that are gender wide. For example, men do display on the far end of violence much more violence than women do in those extremes. Men and women might show violence differently, and they might be violent differently. You see vast differences between boys and girls schools and boys and girls environments. So that could be a difference as well. I believe there's also a difference in even the emotional feelings that one feels in terms of the distress that an event can raise in someone. So if we look at the just isolating for a moment personality trait of neuroticism, my understanding is that women have a standard deviation higher experience of neuroticism than men. We could go out and say there's a really good advantage of being able to have that experience in terms of how you might be available and present to what someone else might be experiencing in, let's say, looking after children and being attuned in terms of connection with other people on a social front. We could go out and say it's useful for men to feel less if they are more involved in risky behaviors. I don't know how it lands, but there are some differences. So therefore, I think some stressors would be different, whether it's role-based, life-based, the things that we need to do, our responsibilities, and also some biological, personality things different. And obviously, from a health perspective, we do have a different makeup. That means that we have different ailments, illnesses, medical problems to deal with. So there are vastly different. Even small differences are large when you think about that being over the course of a lifetime, the repeated requirement to do something. So I think there are gender differences, and that doesn't really say anything other than we should acknowledge them, be aware of them, but not use them as, in a less charitable way to say something, negative about one or the other.
Because women are more emotional, slash neurotic in general. Same gender difference also applies. Men can move on easily than women in a complicated situation. The reason I'm asking, I was reading somewhere and they said that in LGBTQ community, when there is a female-female problem happens, both of them going into the loop much deeper, much in a worse way than when a male and male relationship.
Look, I don't know how that works, and it's really about the sensitivity of that negative emotion that one might feel, but that's on a population basis, so it's difficult to say what it might look like on an individual. We can also go and see there's a standard deviation difference between men and women in terms of agreeableness, so that women are more agreeable on an average basis than men. So men are more disagreeable on an average basis. So the question of whether something's good or bad always lies in what's the context. Sometimes it's useful to have sensitivity to emotions. Other times it might be something that needs to be moderated. Sometimes it's very useful to be disagreeable. Other times it's something that needs to be moderated. And likewise, the opposite, the inverse is true. So being highly agreeable can sometimes mean that you're conflict avoidant. And sometimes conflict is useful. Now, conflict doesn't necessarily mean aggression and violence. It could be just holding an opinion, holding a position. It can feel like it's a conflict, but it might not be. It might be just simply saying, this is just my preference. Some people find it so hard to even say to their partner what their food preference is because they want to keep them happy. They don't want to upset them. They don't want to rock the boat. That's probably not an uncommon thing because we're courteous and respectful and thoughtful, but even that little context might say something. We could explore that as well. So, there's many differences, but it's hard to say how it applies to a single population and whether it's good or bad. I think even that diagnosis of good or bad, right or wrong, that's kind of that clinging attachment. It's got to be one of the dichotomies versus it's actually contextual rather than a category, a label, a right or wrong. So we're trying to abandon the thought of right and wrong, and rather than that, just to replace it with context.
I was reading some data around mental health first aid in Australia. Most of the mental health first aid facilitators are women, and who are attending those seminars or those courses, more than 70% are women. Who is better when it comes to a problem and seeking help?
In terms of the first aid, that is interesting that women attend those courses more. If I understood your statement there, that wouldn't surprise me. It might relate also to potentially women occupying more of the roles, the humanities roles, the people-centered roles, and therefore they're sent on training more. So, for example, in psychology, it's not a 50-50 split. In nursing, it's not a 50-50 split. In teaching, it's not a 50-50 split. The reasoning for that could be a split like that. It could be a different split as well. So the context is important there. But in terms of who might be better, I don't know. Hence, even when we're engaging with a health professional, quite often what's important is that we try and connect with someone that resonates for us. So in my clinic, when a new client contacts, we ask them, would you prefer a male or a female clinician? And for whatever reason, we have preferences. It might be a familiarity thing. It might be an embarrassment thing. It might be trust thing. We often do have a preference. Now, some people don't have a preference at all on that item. They're just seeking, some advice as to who do you recommend might support me best in my particular current challenges. But many do have a preference. And so the question of better is often actually explained by the person, because therapy is not just something you do, it's a process. And that is true for lots of things. Now, in hindsight, we're quite happy to have, men and women in all aspects, but there are dynamic differences. For example, many people today have, especially, for example, women, and I imagine men do the same on the other end, If it's got something to do with your, let's say, sexual anatomy, we quite often would prefer the same sex to have a look at that, right? So, yeah, I imagine most women who are looking for, a pap smear, or there has to be some sort of examination, are going to be more familiar and more comfortable with another female doing that investigation and examination and the like. Similarly, men might feel the same if they're doing a prostate check or any other check involving their genitalia. So I think the question's often more about what does the person, human being desire? But from a competence point of view, I think the competence is, would be even, because even professionals, we're asked to actually play a role, not to just present the way that I am. So, psychologists have to hold a particular distance and a particular type of relationship with all of their clients. And so if we notice that we are feeling more comfortable with the client or less comfortable with the client, we have to obviously do something about that. And there's introspection and supervision that we do to make sure it doesn't obviously affect something in the room in an unintended way. Feeling comfortable with someone can be just as blinding as feeling uncomfortable with someone.
You are right. I mean, I prefer like sexual or psychological anything with a male. In my head, it goes that he will understand my emotion much better. Again, perception, bias, to whatever you call it. Yeah, same thing.
But it's important. I know that another bloke is going to know what I'm talking about. It's like, if that's true for you, then it's true.
Hmm. All the other emotions like FOMO or fear of uncertainty or fear of unknown, it's again contextual, I can imagine, but who handle is better, or it's another individual thing again.
Yeah, look, it is another individual thing, and there's two parts. I think you mentioned in your previous question there was an element about almost like help seeking behavior as well. I think there is data that is fairly solid around that women do seek help better than men in terms of they engage more, they talk about those issues more, they might see a doctor earlier in their in their experience. Men might kind of wait a little bit later, they don't take care of themselves as much, there's less self-care behaviors that we see. I'm not quite sure whether I can categorize either one as being right nor wrong. There is context. There is much time being spent on checking things that aren't there. The argument would be, but if something is there and you've checked, then you found it. Now, in psychology, we can have a health anxiety, which is the very, very pointy end of it, which is interpreting lots of things that are happening in you, a sensation, as being dangerous. That would be the very pointy end. And so you're seeking reassurance from your GP very, very often. The other part of the extreme would be someone who's found a considerable sized lump in an area that obviously, if we ask the 100 people on the street, should it be checked out? Everyone says yes. The person avoids it and says, I'll do it later, I'm too busy. Both of those things can be true among men and women. So I don't know we can say who handles it better. I think they're equal, but just in different ways. There is value in, let's say, the stoic man. If we do a stereotype, the stoic man, that can have lots of benefits. It can allow someone to try and internally work that out by themselves without needing somebody else. So they could develop resilience. But there's also resilience in being vulnerable and saying, why should I do this by myself if I've got a community around me and I can establish and forge a bigger bond? We could argue both sides, and hence why I don't think there's a one size fits all. And I wouldn't say someone who's stoic that they need to be vulnerable. And I wouldn't say someone who is seeking, assurance and connection and support from others not to. We might temporarily to maybe develop a skill, but then the person can choose how they apply that.
Identity, belonging, social acceptance, are these typically main problem?
No, both I think are very strong in that. How we do it might be different, though. If we watch little kids, boys will fight for their identity and will fight for acceptance and for status. They'll more often than not do it much more, physically than what we might see in a girls' school. But girls will undermine each other, have underhanded comments, and maybe spread rumors and the like in a different way. Now, that's not true for everyone. We're doing some stereotypes now, but we certainly have stereotypes for a reason. At the same time, you've got to hold them very gently and very carefully, because you can't make a statement for an entire population. It's both important to understand the differences, but also understand that the similarities are much greater. So the overlap in the Venn diagram is that men and women are much more similar than they are different. But naturally, we do like to look at the differences, and they are there as well. So, that's why it sticks out. But in general, we're more the same than we are different.
Who suffer more in retirement age?
Oh, it's a good question.
The reason I'm asking, because anyway, female are more into family and stuff. And in retirement, old age, pretty much most of them are around their family, if they're lucky, if they have one. But men are into that struggle of, the outside social status versus we don't have anything to do now inside the family and all these things.
If I go back to my comment around attachment and looking at one's struggle quite often being moderated by how we attach. So whether we're finding something uncomfortable, unbearable, challenging, we're wrestling with something, so much of that is around how we've attached to it. And so retirement, if someone's attached to it really, really strongly, meaning an identity around work and saying that if I'm not doing paid work, I'm not doing proper work, that could create a lot of suffering. Women have to experience this quite often, usually as being child rearing, where they go out and look after a child, and we say, but that's not really promoted in the community. And I think that's changing these days, but it's still hard to get your head around because everyone else is working, and you can see there's a tangible dollar that is coming in every week, fortnight, month, but you don't get that feedback loop, even though children are there and they need an infinite amount of love and care and guidance and nurturing and the like, that appears to somehow feel like it's not rewarded with the same accolades at work. So I don't know if we can go and say one fares better or the other, but there would have to probably be some individual differences in terms of, some differences as well, because if the role was different throughout a lifetime, that will probably also mean that there's some things to change over that need to be reconciled at that time. But even retirement looks very different these days. Some do a clean cut. They go from full-time to zero work. Others go into a part-time arrangement. Others are forced into retirement through injury. Sometimes an inheritance might come and someone says, I don't need to worry about having a pension, and so I can do what I like. There's so many different variations, and also the activities that someone might do where you might be heavily connected both in your work but also in your out of work activities. And so the transition could be quite enjoyable. In another instance, it could be quite painful because it creates a lot of isolation that you might not have experienced previously. So obviously planning for retirement is very important, but also just looking at how do we handle stress, how do we view things, our acceptance model is really important too.
For first generation immigrants, yes, there are few other layers because lack of support, lack of family, sometimes financial problem, sometimes job problem, and all these things. Are men, women from first generation immigrant, they struggle differently?
Once again, I think that there might likely be some differences. At that point, I'd probably need to really understand if we're talking from population basis, there might be some significant cultural differences. So someone coming in with a type of culture coming into the Australian culture, and then if they're maintaining very specific roles from their migrant culture, their first home culture versus their second home Australian culture, even that is very difficult. And as you mentioned, the migrant experience is a unique one as well. There's great isolation, and depending on the people, there might be communication issues, and if so, therefore there's accessibility problems. There's certainly social, financial, more often than not. And when we start looking at those contexts, it is very, very difficult and certainly challenging. Having said that, migrants can sometimes be overrepresented in some of the achievements that they are able to attain in their life, and that might also say about who are the more likely people to migrate, or what circumstances, environment gives rise to that overrepresentation in those areas. So it's always important to look at context and try and understand how did we get to this scenario, and hence why being diligent, thoughtful, mindful, considerate, slow, being happy to be wrong as well. So, I've got a hypothesis, I've got an idea, but I'm also curious and open to what's another position, what's another way of explaining this, because research is really time consuming. It's hard to go out and control for all the extraneous variables, almost impossible. We're more often than not looking for correlations, especially when we look at psychology, sociology, many of the humanities. Although correlation might be strong, it still might be weak in its capacity to predict, because it might be just simply correlated. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Obviously, we have that heuristic, that bias to think if it's correlated, they must be associated, and one gives rise to another.
We are almost in the end of our conversation. So the last question is, what's the difference between being exhausted and being emotionally disconnected, and how they manifest in different genders?
I'm not sure how to answer this without asking the question of what are the definitions of being exhausted and being emotionally disconnected. We do see them being associated in many instances. So, for example, in burnout, we know that one of the key indicators around that is when someone is feeling like there's high demand and there is a lack of resources, and it's over an extended period of time, they can start to feel like they've lost meaning in the work that they do because they can't achieve what they wish, and they can feel exhausted by the demand and exhausted by the lack of being able to provide an outcome that they are looking for in their role. And as a protective mechanism, we could argue they might become emotionally disconnected. So they switch their feelings off, or they might stop caring about others. We can see those things, that those two experiences can connect at times. I can picture in my mind many times when those two might meet, and in different ways as well. But when we think about exhausted, we can be exhausted for so many reasons. Someone's diet alone could be absolutely affecting energy levels at an extreme level. Sleep can be very much a huge predictor of feeling exhausted. There's so many elements to that, and there's no doubt that people who are struggling with, for example, emotional challenges relating to primary relationships. So often when one's relationship is going through some tough times, it can be exhausting. It can be highly draining. And so we can, over time, feel emotionally disconnected or separate from that person. We see this happening all the time, obviously, in relationships, marriages and the like. And sometimes, once again, it can be connected with being exhausted in the responsibilities that we all need to hold when, let's say, we're growing a family and raising a family, and there's so many duties to attend to. So I'm not quite sure how they're exactly connected. I'd say the words themselves are different, and I think most of us would have a different description of what they are. And I suppose when we're thinking about it, we'd always be asking, what does it mean for you, or how would you describe it, to make sense of the context? And this happens in psychology all the time, where I might go out and check in with a client and ask, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated. And they might say, well, I'm not frustrated, I'm just annoyed. or I'm annoyed, I'm just feeling, irritated by, or I'm disappointed. It's very much about what does it mean, and it can often mean lots of things, and language is tricky, and hence why not trying to hold an assumption is important, but maintaining curiosity as to, what does that mean for you, or why did you use that word in particular? Are you feeling any other things as well? We're trying to get a deeper sense and understanding of what someone's experiencing. We could have used any other emotional terms as well, or experiential terms, and I'd be responding in the same way.
So that means it's all about that individual and most of the time, and how we can basically help that individual or how they manifest. We have to be careful and we have to be kind towards it and look after that. Thank you, Nesh, for your time. Thank you.
Lovely speaking with you, Good. Appreciate it.